Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So in this video we'll be starting with the basics of geometry. Okay, so basically geometry we are studying shapes, right? I've seen many students struggling with the basics, so I'll be making a video about the basics which will help you master the other concepts like complex constructions, different solving, prove that, etc. Right? So first of all, because geometry is concerned with shapes, right? हमारे पास बहुत सारे shapes है. हमारे पास point है, we have line segment, we have a ray, right? All these things I have seen are very confusing to students, right? And also, when you're doing geometry, you need to know how you refer to certain things. So अगर एक point है, you need to know how you refer to that point. If you want to talk about a line or a line segment, you need to know how to refer to that. So whenever you're writing your explanation, you write it in the proper way and it gains you marks, right? So in today's video, the topics we'll be covering are point, line segment, ray, angles, 2D shapes, 3D shapes, and the naming of all of these different things. So this is a series where I'll be talking about basics, and this is not just for mathematics, right? I'll be covering many things. I'll be covering mathematics, I'll be covering certain parts of English. If you want a bit of social studies, then we'll also be having other things like paper presentation, right? So this is your basics, clarification of basics series, and this is your very first episode. In the next one, we'll be doing an in-depth into angles because they are extremely important and you need to know a lot about these, right? So first of all, we'll start with points. Now any shape, right, no matter which shape you talk about, is composed of points. So what is a point? You know how in the end of a sentence you write a full stop? So here I have put a full stop, right? Let's make it a bit bigger, but this is like too big for a full stop. But see, this is a point. As such, you see this moving thing? This is what a point is supposed to be. The smallest, right? Just a dot. That is a point. Over here, I've made a bigger circular one so that it's easily visible to you. Points are very important. They are zero dimensional. So now in geometry, you have dimensions. Let us understand what dimensions are. So zero dimensions means it has nothing. You cannot measure a point unless you say like there's 1 point, there's 2 points. You cannot say that there is a length to this point. You cannot say that there's a breadth or a width or a height to this point, right? That means your point has no dimension. Okay, so you have zero dimension, which is basically a point. Now, there are 3 dimensions that we can study. So there is 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, and 3 dimensions. There can be a 4th dimension, but we humans are not capable of perceiving this 4th direction. Right? So what do we mean by perceiving a direction? It is the ability to understand or to experience this dimension. So as we go along, I'll tell you what these dimensions are. So first of all, we'll talk about 1 dimension. It's not the band. 1 dimension means any one measurement. Okay, the dimension here is the measurable quantity. So suppose I make this line over here, right? Okay, not a very straight line. Yeah, so I'll make a line over here, right? Now you can tell me what the length of this line is using a ruler, right? You will keep a scale on this line and you will measure it and you will tell me, okay, this is 5 centimeter or 6 centimeter or 3 centimeter or whatever it is, right? So if you can measure the length, can you measure anything else? Once you measure the length, can you tell me what's the breadth? Can you tell me what its height is? Because it has neither a breadth nor a height and only a length, I will call it one dimensional, right? That means I can only tell one thing about it, either the length or the breadth or the height. So I have made it like this, so it's a length. If I make it like this, it can be a breadth. And if I bring it out, right, it can be a height. Okay, once we're done with this, then you have 2 dimension. What is two dimension? Joining two one dimensions. So what was your one dimension? One dimension was a line. If I join two lines, I will get a two-dimensional figure, right? So you can join two or more lines and they have to just give you a length and a breadth, or a length and a height, or a breadth and a height. So it has to give you only two things. So suppose I make a line over here like this. What is this giving me? It's giving me a length. And I make one more line like this. This line is giving me a breadth, right? So now if I reciprocate this, that is, I make one more line like this, and I make one more line like this. Okay, so now it is giving me length and a breadth. Does it give me height? No. So that means I can only measure two things about this shape or this figure. That means it is two-dimensional. Let's say I add a height to it. Okay, so let's say I make a line like this, and that is giving it some depth, right? So now I can tell you how deep it is inside the screen. Let's say it is 5 centimeter deep into my screen, right? In that case, we are adding another dimension. Now you can tell me the length of this figure, you can tell me the breadth of this figure, and its depth or height. That means it is a three-dimensional shape, right? So let us quickly revise what dimensions are. Dimension is basically how many quantities you can measure about this particular figure. So if you can measure nothing, like in the case of a point, it's a zero dimension. For example, now I make a line. It is one dimension. Why? You can only tell me its length. Let's say I join two lines. Now what you can tell me? You can tell me its length and its breadth, right? Now let's say I add another line but in a different dimension, right? That means I make a cube, a box. What does a box give me? I can tell you the length of the box, I can tell you the breadth of the box, and I can tell you the height of the box. That means it has three dimensions. I can measure three things about it. Alright, so now I hope dimensions are very clear to you. Okay, so now when you're talking about a point, you cannot really measure anything other than the number of points, right? That means nothing is really measurable, so zero dimension, like I told you. This is the most basic thing. Now remember how I told you the last point is that we will be measuring the naming of all different things that you study. Let us see the naming of points. Okay, we'll be covering the naming as we go along. So let's say this point is made over here and I have written the letter A beside it. How will you tell me about this point? You can refer to it as point A, or you can refer to it as point A. Alright. When you're writing theoretical explanations, like you're giving reasons or you're telling why you're assuming something, in that case you will write like this. And when you're just referring to it in a mathematical form, you will use this. Alright. So suppose you have a point here which is X, right? So you will call it point X or point X. Make a dot and write the name beside it. Okay. So now, let's say for example, I am writing the letter M beside a point. You will tell me in the comments what I'll be calling this point. Okay. How I'll be referring to this point over here. Alright. Done with the point, let's move on to the three highlights. Okay, the three things that people are the most confused about. That is line, line segment, and ray. First of all, let us see what a line is. Suppose I make a point here. Alright, then I make another point beside it. I'm making another point, another point, another point, and like this, I make so many points that you cannot see different points. It's like all the points are so close, they're like one after the other, they're jam-packed, and this is what you get, a line. So a collection of points along one direction is a point, is a line. Alright. But is this a line in mathematical terms? No, not exactly. what you call a line is not a line in mathematical terms. Just like what you call work in physics is not work in English. So line in English is not the same as line in mathematics. So let's see. What is a line in mathematics? This straight structure is very common. Alright, one second, not a very straight line. Okay, let's say this one, right? This straight part is very common, but in mathematics, there has to be arrows at the end of this thing. Why so? That is because a line never ends. What does this arrow signify? This arrow means that it goes on forever. Alright, so if there is an arrow over there, it means it is not ending there. It will always keep going on till something obstructs its path. You don't have any obstruction, right? So it is going on in both directions. Okay. Now suppose this line has a point P over here. So sorry. Yeah, and a point Q over here. This line will be called line PQ. Alright, and in symbolical form, what you can do is write PQ over here and make a small line above these letters. Okay, so there is one way of writing this. Now, there is one more way of writing the line. How? For example, you have a line over here. Alright, there are two arrows. And at the end of one of these, there is a little small letter written over here. So let's write a small m, right? It's not capital, it's a small letter. So if it is at one end and there is nothing all throughout the line, you can also call it line M. Alright. Now, one thing that you need to remember, if you're writing it in this form with two letters, it has to be two capital letters. And the points with which you're referring to the line have to be on your line, like in this case, right? So there is a point over here and a point over here, and both are on the line. Meanwhile, in this case, where you're using a small letter and only a single letter, the letter has to be beside your line. There should be no point touching the line, and it has to be a small letter. It can't be a capital letter. Alright? I hope that's very clear. Now we'll move on to its cousin, which is a line segment. Right? So what is with line segment? With line segment, it's a straight line. So what you call a line in English is a line segment in mathematics. It has two endpoints. So I'm referring to this point as A, this endpoint as B. Now if you see this, the line segment, unlike your line, doesn't have two arrows. That is because it's a segment. Okay, so you might have heard that there is a segment of the show, right? What does it mean? It's a small part in the show. There is a segment in a show wherein they'll be doing crowd work. Alright, there's a segment in the stand-up comedy show where they'll be doing a crowd work. That segment actually has two endpoints, right? It's definitive. It's only a small part. The comedian will be doing that crowd work only for about half an hour or 1 hour, right? So just like that, a segment has two endpoints. It's a small part of a never-ending line. So now, since we know segment has two endpoints, we know just like the line, we can write it as line AB, right? But since this is a segment, you'll be writing it as line segment AB. Now remember how we used to refer to a line in symbolical form? Similarly, line segment can also be referred in the form of a symbol. So you will write AB over here and make a small line above it. Alright, it's a segment. One second. When you're writing, make sure there is no arrow, just a small line, like a dash, right? Now, there is a very rare chance that you might do this, but suppose there is M over here. You cannot write this as line segment M. Okay, it does not make any sense. That is only for lines. Okay, So this here is completely wrong. You cannot do this. You will not write it as line M. You don't have to write anything. Only if you find two arrows and then a small letter beside it, can you write line M. Alright. Now let's move to both their cousin, a ray. What is a ray? So remember how you say ray of sunshine, right? You make sun over here. For example, this is your sun, okay? And you start it and it goes on like this. And rays are always going on, right? So similar to sunshine, right? A ray will start at a point, okay? Will start at a definitive point and go on to an indefinite point. So there is a starting point over here. Let's call it P. And there is an ending point over here. Let's call it O. Okay. Now you can call it ray PO. Okay. You can call it ray PO. Remember, the definite point, the point where you're starting the ray, is going to be the first point. And the point where you're ending your ray, or where the end is not definite, will be the second point when writing the name of the ray. In line and line segment, it doesn't matter. But when you're writing a ray, it has two components to it. It has one ending point and one never ending point. You have to make sure it's very clear using your name. And how do you write it in the form of symbol? In the form of a symbol, you will first write the end point or the definitive point. Then you'll write the never ending point or the arrow point. And then make a small ray over it. So a line and the arrow. Make sure where the point is ending, you have the fixed point, and where there is an arrow is your arrow end of the ray. Once we are clear with all of this, let us do a small side-by-side comparison so you are not confused. Alright. First of all, you have a line, okay, so which is like this. Then you have a line segment which is like this. Then you have a ray which is like this. Okay. Now line segment and ray. Okay. Line will have arrows at both ends to show that it is never ending. Line segment will have point at both ends to show that it is ending at 2 points. It has definite length. Okay. Then you have a ray which has a point at one end and an arrow at the other, showing that it has a definite starting point but it doesn't have an ending point. Okay. Line you can refer to using a small letter or two capital letters. Line segment you can refer to using two capital letters, and so is the case for your ray. Okay. Now, for example, you have this line over here. Okay. I am going to make this M, point M and point N. Okay. You will tell me one line segment and a ray in this figure. Alright, and I'll be writing L over here, which is the most common notation for a line. So this is going to be your question for line segment and ray. You have one question for point and one for line segment and ray. Okay, so in around 20 minutes, we have covered point and line segment and ray, which is your one dimension. So we are done with 0 dimension and 1 dimension. Let us move on to 2 dimensions. Now comes something that is extremely important, extremely versatile, and a bit confusing to new learners. Okay. Why is it a bit confusing? That is because one, you have two rays which are completely new shapes for you, and two, angles are having a huge variety. Alright. You differentiate them based on how they are sized, how they look. Alright. So There'll be an in-depth video, the next video on angles, and in this one I'll be just covering the basics. I'll be brushing up whatever you need right now. Okay, so this is good for your like 5th, 6th level. Okay, so angles are made of two rays. Okay, you need two rays to make one angle. Okay, so suppose this is one point. One ray is like this. Okay, that's one ray. Starting from the same point of the beginning of first ray, you make one more ray. Okay, like this. This is your fixed arm, and let's say this is your movable arm. Okay, I'll give it names. Okay, this point will be A, this will be B, and this will be C. Now there are certain parts of angles that you need to know. This common starting point you see, it is called a, one second, yeah, it is called a vertex. Okay, a vertex. So this common starting point is called a vertex. Now angles are basically the measurement of this thing. Okay, now think of a circle. All right, you can measure the circumference, all right, but how do you measure what's inside the circle? So to divide a circle into equal parts, the older mathematicians decided to divide it into 360 equal parts. Now why did we land on such an odd number, right? 360. It could have been 10, it could have been 100, it could have been 1000. That would be much better, but why 360? 360 because it is divisible by so many numbers. Okay, you can divide it by 1, obviously. You can divide it by 2 because it has a 0 in the end. You can divide it by 3 because it has 3 and 6 which sum up to 9, which is divisible by 3. Okay, can we divide it by 4? Yes, we can divide it by 4. 5? Yes. 6? Yes. So mostly all the numbers that you will be requiring, you can divide it by that. You can also divide it by 10. You can divide it by something like 12, right? So it's very convenient to do that. And another reason is because we needed to measure time. Alright. Day has 24 hours. We needed a clock. And circle is the easiest way to measure time. Why? Because circle can be divided into as many pieces you want. We divide it into 24 pieces. How do I decide how many parts or how much I give to each piece? 360 is divisible by 24. Isn't it so much easier right now? So we landed up on 360. Now this is an explanation I'm giving you. I'm not really sure what was in the minds of mathematicians, but these are the perks of having 360. Alright, so this whole circle is divided into 360 parts, and each part is called an angle, right? So 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, like that you have 360 degrees. So a whole circle is 360 degrees. That is 360 degrees for you. An angle is basically the measure. So suppose I have this fixed arm over here. Alright, this is my fixed arm. Wherever my movable arm lands, okay, so suppose this is where my movable arm is landing, the measure of the angle between these two is what I call the measure of this angle or the degree of this angle. Alright, right now it might be seeming very confusing, but in the next video I'll be covering the measurement of angles, how you draw angles, using different tools, right, all of that. And there is a video that I've put up on my channel wherein you can draw different angles using a scale, a pencil, and a compass. You do not need the angle measuring tool, which is a protractor for this. Alright, so this is your angles basically. Angles are differentiated based on what is the size or what is the degree of this angle. So I'll tell you the main differences. There is acute angle, which is less than 90 degrees. Then you have a right angle, 90 degrees. Then you have an obtuse angle which is greater than 90 degrees. Then you have a straight angle 180 degrees. And then you have reflex angle which is anything greater than 180 degrees. Okay. This is it for angles. Now let's move on to the naming of angles. How will you refer to an angle, right? To refer to an angle, you need to make sure that you have 3 points on the angle. One has to be the common starting point of the vertex and one each on the two rays. Okay. So for example, and how do you show the symbol? Just like line had a symbol, line segment had a symbol and ray had a symbol, angle has a symbol like this. Okay. Think of it like a resting V. The V is resting on one of its arms. Alright. Think of it like an open crocodile mouth with the lower one resting on the ground and the upper one open to hunt. Alright. How do I decide what letter comes first, second and third? This common point you see, this vertex, it will come in the center. And these two can come wherever you wish. So it can be ABC, angle ABC. Ooh, 1 second. Yeah, it can be angle ABC or it can be angle CBA. Or you can just write angle instead of this and write ABC or CBA. Okay, done. That's it. If you write CAB, it will be a different angle. If you write ACB, that's a different angle. If you want to refer to this angle, this letter has to be in the center. Alright. Okay. Now let us move on to our next 2D figure, which is 2D shapes. Now there are two types of shapes, 2D shapes and 3D shapes. When we are talking about 2D shapes, there have to be two dimensions like I told you. So there can be a length and a breadth, what you are talking about basically. Alright. You should be able to measure only the area of this thing. There should be no volume to it, only area. What are such shapes? Such shapes are circle. Alright. Then you have a square. Okay. Then you have a rectangle. Alright. No, that's not a very appealing rectangle. 1 second. Then you have a rectangle. You also have a triangle. So all the basic shapes you learn to draw as kids, that are 2D shapes. You can measure the length of a square. 1 second, I'll just yeah. So you can measure the length of this rectangle, you can measure the breadth of this rectangle, length of the square, breadth of the square. You can measure the length of your triangle, you can measure the breadth of your triangle. It's called different things though. This is called the height of the triangle and this is called the width of the triangle. Alright. For a circle, you can measure the length like this. You can measure the breadth like this, which is both going to be the same, but you can measure it that way. Alright. And all of these shapes you can find the area of. Now, how would I name these figures? Alright. First of all, we'll go step by step. You cannot make a shape using two lines. What is the next number? 3. So what shape can I make using 3 lines? A triangle, right? So how will I name it? For example, the corners are called A, B and C, right? This is point A, this is point B and this is point C. I'll name it triangle A, B, C. It can also be BAC, it can also be CAB, it can be CBA, whatever your heart pleases. Alright. Now that's the figure I can make with 3 lines. What about 4 lines? What can I make? I can make a square with 4 lines. Now can't I? So for example, I have a square here. Not exactly 90 degrees, but bear with it. Okay. So this square is P, Q, R, S, for example, right? How will I name this? I can call it square P, Q, R, S. But if I start here, it will be Q, R, S, P. If I start here, if I start here, R, S, P, Q, right? How will we write it symbolically? Triangle. Just make a small triangle, A, B, C. Small triangle, B, A, C. Square. Make a small square, P, Q, R, S. Make a small square, Q, R, S, P. Okay, whatever you please. Now, same thing for a rectangle, right? I have a rectangle here. Suppose it's M, N, O, P. It will be rectangle M, N, O, P. Okay. Whatever figure has four sides, four-sided figure is called a quadrilateral. Now, quadrilaterals are a very wide topic. Why? You don't have only a basic square and rectangle. You have so many things. You have a diamond. You have what's called a rhombus. You have a kite. You have a parallelogram. You have trapezium. There are so many things to it, right? So quadrilaterals are a very wide topic. If you want, I'll make a video on that. But as of now, the main thing is that you should know how to name all of these, right? So this is how you name different 2D figures. Now let's come to 3D figures. You don't need to know how to name 3D figures, but I'll just give you a small introduction to what 3D shapes are, right? 3D shapes are basically when you have a square and you decide to give it a height. That's it. You're like, okay, fine, you deserve a height. Here. So there's a length, there's a breadth, and then there's a height. That's all. Naming a 3D figure is not something that you have to do right now, so we'll not get into that. You can also do the same thing with a rectangle where you give it height. But what about a circle, right? Circle is diverse. When you decide to give circle a height, it becomes something called a cylinder. Yeah, so right, I'll join this end and this end, and that's a cylinder. But when I decide that this is a circle, it has to get bigger and fuller. Like if I see it from here, it's a circle. If I turn it 90 degrees or whatever degrees, it's still a circle. That's called a sphere, like a ball, right? Then you can also do the same thing with your triangle, wherein it will be called a prism. So even 3D shapes are a very diverse topic where you can find like multiple 3D shapes, and they're actually very interesting, okay, 3D shapes, because the possibilities are endless, whatever you can do. If you want, we'll make a video on 3D shapes, but that does not come under basics. That will be just basic curiosity. I'll make a short on it or whatever. So as of now, we have discussed everything you need. We are done with 0, 1, 2 and 3 dimensions. 0 dimension is a point, and whatever happens in the other 3 dimensions is all with the 0 dimensional point. So you make multiple such 0 dimensional points one after the other in a single direction. You get a 1 dimension figure called a line or a line segment or a ray. Alright. So if it's fixed number of fixed distance that you're making the points over, it's a line. If there is no fixed distance, it can go on forever, it's a line. Okay, wait, so no. If it's fixed, it's a line segment, and if it goes on forever, it's a line. And if it has a fixed starting point but doesn't have a fixed ending point, it's a ray. Okay. Now coming to 2 dimension, if I'm adding 2 of these 1 dimensional things, what does it give me? So suppose I'm getting 2 rays together, it gives me an angle, right? Suppose I am having 2 lines, right? It will give me somewhat of a figure like this, not really anything. But I add one more line, oh, it's giving me a closed shape. We'll call that a triangle. That's a 2D shape. Add one more line, bam, a square. Elongate some lines. Okay, fine, here you go, a rectangle, right? No, I want this thing but curved or like, tilted. Fine, you have a kite or a diamond or whatever you like to call this, right? So that's 2D shapes. For example, now I decide to give these some depth or height. That's 3D shapes. That is 3 dimensions. What can you measure? You can measure length, breadth and height or depth. Remember, for 2D shapes, you can only measure area, and for 3D shapes, you can only measure, up to the volume. That's the basics of geometry. We have studied different basic structures in geometry. We have studied how you name them, and we have studied how you use them. Alright. Next one is going to be about angles, the types of angles, how to measure them, how to make them, etc. That's it for the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. And there is one thing I need to tell you. There is a website or an app called medium.com. Therein, for students like yourself, I am posting different essays and letters. You will find them for free, right? You can search up G3 Academics, and there are so many different letters that I have posted. There are all formal, informal letters. There are different essays. There's a lot of creative writing in there as well. I am yet to post notice and email, but that will be posted very soon too. Don't forget to check that out and tell me what you feel about those. So that's it for the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and thanks for watching.